Welcome back for the dramatic conclusion of Lecture 17. In Part 2b, we're going to be talking about acid-base balance, a very, very important topic, not only physiologically but clinically as well. This is going to be the last part of Chapter 26 from Merib. Now let's just talk about acids and bases in general. There really are only a couple of things that I want you to get from this slide. When we talk about strong acids, we're talking about entities that can ionize more completely and release more hydrogen ion. Remember, that's the definition of an acid, something that will release hydrogen ion into solution. So strong acids, for example, like hydrochloric acid, when this goes into an aqueous solution, it will dissociate into hydrogen ions and into chloride ions and pretty much stay completely dissociated like this. And something that stays dissociated and keeps those hydrogen ions in solution is known as a strong acid. So that concept is pretty simple. Now, the weak acids really are the ones that are important for us as buffers in the body, okay, as it says here. And these are acids that ionize less completely and release fewer hydrogen ions in solution. One of the weak acids that we took a look at before was H2CO3, which, if you remember, was carbonic acid. And what can happen is this can dissociate into hydrogen ions and then bicarbonate. But the thing that happens with this is this will eventually come back together and form that again. So this doesn't stay completely dissociated like the hydrochloric acid that we looked at in the last example. And for that reason, since it donates fewer free hydrogen ions permanently to solution, we say that this is a weak acid. But this is really an ideal characteristic for this to act as a buffer. Remember, something that resists changes in pH, because it can just as readily dissociate and release a hydrogen ion as it can to absorb a hydrogen ion and take them back from solution, so resist pH change. Not surprisingly, we also have strong bases and weak bases. The definitions of these is pretty much the same as it is for acids, except now we're talking about the reverse case, where bases are things that will, instead of releasing hydrogen ion, they bind hydrogen ions. Strong bases will more completely bind and stay attached to hydrogen ion than weak bases will. So this is just a little general introduction to acids and bases before we get started. Now let's talk a little bit about the sources of hydrogen ions. You'll notice that there are several different sources from which we can get hydrogen ions. Let's take a look at each one. First of all, we have aerobic respiration of glucose. And this will generate carbonic acid. How does that happen? Well, if you remember, one of the things that we generate during aerobic respiration of glucose is CO2. Hopefully you remember how CO2 is related to carbonic acid. Remember, when CO2 combines with water, this can form carbonic acid, H2CO3, and that can eventually dissociate, as we just said, into hydrogen ion plus bicarbonate ion. Okay, so this will actually contribute some acid to the body as well. So through aerobic respiration of glucose. We can also have anaerobic respiration of glucose. Remember that one of the primary products of this was lactic acid. And this in itself is an acid. Remember that this comes from pyruvate in the absence of oxygen. We also have oxidation of sulfur-containing amino acids that generate sulfuric acid, one of the other acids in the body. We can also have incomplete oxidation of fatty acids, and that leads to the production of the acidic ketone bodies that we've talked about several times. Beta-hydroxybutyric acid, acetoacetic acid. These are ketone bodies that will acidify body fluids. And finally, we have hydrolysis of phosphoproteins as well as nucleic acids. These are things that contain phosphate groups, and so these will eventually release phosphoric acid into solution. All of these basically will contribute hydrogen ion into the internal environment. Now, some hydrogen ion is also absorbed from the digestive tract. Remember that in the stomach, we have a pretty high secretion of hydrogen ions by the parietal cells, and some of these do make it down to the intestinal tract and do get absorbed, so we can absorb some hydrogen ion from the digestive tract. Okay, so the important thing now is, since we know where the hydrogen ions come from, and since we know we have all these different sources that contribute hydrogen ion into the body, how do we actually control the pH of the body so it doesn't radically shift when these hydrogen ions do make it into the fluids? Well, one of the systems that we have is called a chemical acid-base buffer system. This really is just based on a purely physical type reaction, a chemical reaction, And the thing about this is it happens very, very quickly, just in seconds. And so this can form a first line of defense against pH change in the body. And this buffer system we're going to take a look at in a little bit. The only thing about this chemical acid-base buffer system is that it can temporarily tie up acids, for example, hydrogen ion, or bases, hydroxide ion. The thing about this, though, is it cannot eliminate these from the body. So these hydrogen ions or hydroxyl ions are bound, but they can't be gotten rid of by this particular system. Now we have two other systems. One of them is called the respiratory system. And this system, as we know from the respiratory system and talking about several other things, this is very good at excreting carbon dioxide via exhaling the gas. This is a physiological buffer because we need intact cellular physiology in order for this particular respiratory process to take place, as you might imagine. We need lungs, we need an apparatus to inhale, to exhale, so on and so forth. So this is a physiological buffer system, and it actually can eliminate excess acid. And we say that it does this indirectly via elimination of CO2. So it doesn't do it directly by eliminating hydrogen ion from the body, but it does it indirectly by eliminating CO2. And if we go back to our equation again of CO2 and water will form carbonic acid, which can dissociate into hydrogen ion plus bicarbonate, we'll realize that if we can get rid of CO2, we talked about this earlier, that this pulls this equation this way, and we'll take this hydrogen from here and we'll move it this way, eventually eliminating it from the body. This is why we say we indirectly eliminate excess acid via the respiratory mechanism. And the very last method we have of excreting hydrogen ion is renal excretion of hydrogen ions. This is by far the most powerful and versatile system we have for getting rid of hydrogen ions from the body. This is also a physiological buffer. We need an intact kidney, of course, to do this. This can directly eliminate hydrogen ion. So in the urine, we can put hydrogen ion and that can be excreted from the body. So this is a direct elimination from the body. We can see that we have these two physiological mechanisms that can excrete hydrogen ion from the body, either indirectly in the case of the respiratory system or directly in the case of the renal system. Now, how do these compare with the chemical acid-base buffer system? One way of comparing these is to look at the amount of time it takes for these systems to kick in and work. The chemical acid-base buffer system, remember we said, works in seconds. This is very, very quick, and that's the reason it functions as a first line of defense. The respiratory system usually takes minutes or so before this kicks in, so before our breathing rate can actually change and adjust levels of CO2 in the blood. The renal system, which is the most powerful system that we have, might take hours to a day before this can actually regulate the concentration of hydrogen ion in different body fluids. So the time between these is different. Another difference between these is, remember that the chemical acid-base buffer system is a physical system, whereas these two are physiological system. And the last difference is whether or not the system can eliminate hydrogen ion, either directly or indirectly. These cannot eliminate hydrogen ion. The respiratory and renal system can. The respiratory system does it indirectly. The renal system does it directly. Okay, so there are a few similarities and differences between these. The major similarities, of course, is that all of these control pH in the body. They all regulate hydrogen ion in the body. So just a couple of examples of strong acids and weak acids, just so we can look at some of these buffers. The bicarbonate system is certainly one of the most important buffers that we have, and it's all based upon this equation that we've been coming back to many, many times. The normal concentration of bicarbonate in the body is about 25 milliequivalents per liter. And we've talked about the mechanism of this basically several times, so I won't belabor this. The phosphate system is very similar to the bicarbonate system because, as you see, it can also soak up or release hydrogen ions. So this goes to a monohydrogen phosphate or a dihydrogen phosphate species, and these can either bind to or release the hydrogen ions from the body. So both of these systems basically will buffer or resist changes in pH, and these are both part of the chemical buffer system, so the physical type buffer system. The last component of the chemical or physical buffer system is the protein buffer system, which is probably the most important buffer system that we have, especially intracellularly. Inside cells, remember, we have lots and lots of proteins that can't get out of the cells. And these proteins are, of course, made up of amino acids. On the bottom, we see the sequence that an amino acid can go through where it can bind a hydrogen ion or release a hydrogen ion, depending on the pH. So if we start out here at neutral pH, or a pH of 7, like we might find in a normal cell, you'll notice the typical amino acid species that we have here. So central carbon, we have a hydrogen, we have an amino group on this side, and we have a carboxylic acid group on this side. This hydrogen that you see right here, when the pH rises, this hydrogen ion can come away, and what we can have is a reaction like we see over here. So when the pH goes up, this can release hydrogen ion into solution to resist the pH change. On the other hand, when the pH falls and goes down, those excess hydrogen ions that come from the falling pH, or the increased concentration of hydrogen ion, can actually be bound by the amino group and thus cause less of a change in the pH inside cells. Now, of course, inside cells is not the only place that we have proteins, right? We have proteins in the plasma, we have albumins, we have the alpha globulins, beta globulins, all those different proteins in the plasma. Remember that we also have hemoglobin inside red blood cells. This is a protein, and we actually saw the mechanism of buffering with hemoglobin when we talked about the respiratory system. Remember, some hydrogen ion can actually bind to the proteins in the hemoglobin chains. So this can also work as a buffer system. So really what we say here is that this protein buffering system is the most plentiful and powerful chemical buffer system, although certainly the bicarbonate and phosphate buffer systems do contribute to resisting changes in pH, and they are important. Now let's talk a little bit about the respiratory system for controlling pH. Remember, some of the major characteristics of this is, of course, number one, it can work as a buffer system to resist changes in pH. It's a physiological buffer system. We need intact cells and tissues and organs running in order to accomplish what the system accomplishes. The other thing we said is that this may take minutes in order to kick in and actually affect carbon dioxide concentration in the body. So how does this work? Well, we've been through this many, many times before. If cells increase their production of CO2, that CO2 is going to react with water to produce carbonic acid. The carbonic acid is going to dissociate into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. The hydrogen ion in turn is going to stimulate the respiratory centers. That's going to increase our rate and depth of breathing, which in turn will eliminate CO2 and indirectly eliminate acid from the body. Okay, so this is how this whole system works. I know we've been through this a number of times, but this is just by way of review. And next we want to look at the renal excretion of hydrogen ions. We talked pretty extensively about the kidney, but we really didn't talk extensively about how the kidneys work in terms of regulating pH in the body. And that's really what we want to turn our attention to now. As I mentioned before, and as it says here, the kidneys really are the most powerful and versatile acid-base regulating system in the body. And remember that these function by direct elimination of hydrogen ion. So unlike the chemical buffer system, which can't eliminate hydrogen ion at all, and the respiratory system, which can only indirectly eliminate hydrogen ion, these can do it directly. The only problem with this system, if you remember from what we talked about before, is it might take hours, maybe days, before the system can actually affect a change in the pH of the body. However, it is the most powerful and the most versatile acid-base regulating system, as we said here. Let's take a look at an example of how they might work in a general way, and then we'll look at some specifics in a second. If we take in, for example, lots of proteins, somebody eats a high protein diet, that will increase the metabolism of amino acids, and especially those amino acids that contain sulfur and phosphate will wind up producing sulfuric acid and phosphoric acid. This will dramatically increase the hydrogen ion concentration in body fluids. And what the kidneys will do, because of the increased hydrogen ion concentration, is increase the secretion of hydrogen ion into fluid in the renal tubules, especially in the distal convoluted tubule, as we talked about. Remember that when we want to excrete hydrogen ion in the distal convoluted tubule, we exchange those for sodium ion. And what this will do, of course, is increase the hydrogen ion concentration in the urine, and that's going to return the concentration of body fluids toward more normal levels. Now, what we want to look at here is a buffering mechanism of the kidney. We looked at the increased hydrogen ion secretion of the kidneys in response from a high hydrogen ion concentration in the body. But let's take a look at the other side of the coin, which is the bicarbonate. Here, just to set this up, you'll see we have a peritubular capillary. Here we have a tubule cell around the kidney, and then here we have the lumen where the urine would be. You'll notice these different substances in the urine. For example, we have like bicarbonate, we have monohydrogen phosphate, we also have things like ammonia. And all of these things, if you notice, are basically soaking up additional hydrogen ions. And so these buffers in the urine are important because they can take hydrogen ion that's taken from the cells or through the tubule cells. They can bind the hydrogen ion, and these things are eventually going to pass out in the urine. So these buffers that we have in the urine are important, in fact, and they're really a primary way that we excrete as much hydrogen ion as we excrete. Now, the other thing I want to call to your attention here is our bicarbonate. Notice that what can happen is when we have bicarbonate appear in the tubular fluid, and we talked about this in conjunction with the kidneys before, this will combine with hydrogen ion to form carbonic acid. This will dissociate into water and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide will come back into the tubule cells where it will be converted back into bicarbonate, and that bicarbonate will then go into the peritubular capillaries. And as you might imagine, that bicarbonate is an important buffer of hydrogen ions in the body fluids, so bringing bicarbonate back into the circulatory system is very important to work as a buffer for the body. There's another way as well. If you look down the bottom here on the right-hand panel, this is the second way that the kidneys actually can work with a buffering system and bring bicarbonate back into the body. In fact, what the kidneys can do is produce new bicarbonate. Rather than just absorbing the bicarbonate that's in the tubular fluid already, they can actually make new bicarbonate by taking an amino acid like glutamine and stripping it of the amino group and then forming bicarbonate from that, and that bicarbonate is then absorbed in the peritubular capillaries. And you can see that the ammonium ion that we have here, or the ammonia, both of these go into the tubular fluid, and they work kind of in a similar way to what we talked about before in the upper left-hand panel over here. So the kidneys are very powerful at buffering because not only can they secrete and excrete additional hydrogen ion, but they also work with bicarbonate to extensively reabsorb bicarbonate, which is one of the most important buffers in the body. So as a summary of acid-base balance, this really sums up most of the things that we talked about before. The only thing I'll mention here is remember that the chemical buffer system cannot eliminate hydrogen ion. It can only tie it up. The physiological buffer systems, the respiratory mechanisms, the renal mechanisms, can excrete hydrogen ion from the body, except the respiratory system does it indirectly. The renal mechanism can do it directly. The other thing that I have listed on here, if you notice, is the time course of how fast these things work. The chemical buffer systems work very quickly. The respiratory system may take minutes to kick in, and the renal system, which is the most powerful system, might take hours to days to kick in. Let's talk next about acidosis and alkalosis, since we've been talking about maintaining pH in the body. Now this is very important because, as you see up here in the first statement on top of the slide, if the pH of arterial blood drops to 6.8 or rises to 8.0, so it goes to these extremes for more than a few hours, survival is very definitely jeopardized. So big swings in pH in the arterial blood is very, very dangerous for the body. So controlling the pH is extremely important. And if you remember, we talked about the normal homeostatic range of blood pH or plasma pH being 7.35 to 7.45. So you can see that these values here are way far out of the normal homeostatic range. Our average for normal blood plasma pH is 7.4, as it says here down on this pH line. And one of the things we have to think about is our ability to maintain this normal pH of blood plasma is really dependent upon the levels of bicarbonate, HCO3-, as well as hydrogen ion. You can think of these as kind of being on a seesaw. Levels of these will definitely determine whether or not we go into acidosis or alkalosis. And the important thing to consider here is that it's sometimes not so much the absolute concentrations of these as it is the ratio between these two. So you'll notice from this diagram that I have here, we have a child seesaw, for example, that if this side of the scale goes up, that means bicarbonate goes down, and vice versa. And so really it's an interplay between hydrogen ion and bicarbonate that determines whether or not the body is in a state of acidosis or alkalosis. So let's take a look at what these terms mean. First of all, when we talk about an acidosis, we're talking about a pH of less than 7.35. So something lower than the normal lower limit of our pH homeostatic range. On the other hand, when we talk about an alkalosis, we're talking about a pH that's greater than 7.45. Okay, so anything outside these normal limits. Acidosis is too low a pH, alkalosis is too high a pH. So this determines whether we say that something is an acidosis or an alkalosis, but we also have to think about the cause of the acidosis and alkalosis. And if you look on this slide, this is number 1 here. And we in general have 2 causes of alkalosis and acidosis: the respiratory system or anything else. So anytime it's the respiratory system that causes a problem, we call that a respiratory acidosis or a respiratory alkalosis. Anytime it's anything other than levels of CO2 that cause the problem, we refer to that as a metabolic acidosis or a metabolic alkalosis. I want you to notice this diagram here. What we're saying is that this top panel here is showing how we get into acidosis, okay? We're not talking about the cause right here, but we're just talking about going into acidosis. I want you to notice that acidosis will definitely mean an increased concentration of hydrogen ion in the body. So this can result from, pay attention to this, either an accumulation of acids or a loss of bases. Once again, remember, it's these relative levels of things that we're talking about here. If we accumulate more acid than we should have, and we don't increase the amount of base, we go into acidosis. If we lose bases, and we don't lose hydrogen ion at the same time, that will put us in a state of acidosis as well. The converse is true on the bottom. In a state of alkalosis, you'll notice that when we lose too much acid or we gain too many bases, that can put us in a state of alkalosis. Once again, though, remember, it's the relative levels of acids and bases that determine whether or not we're in alkalosis or acidosis. Okay, so let's take a look at the different causes of these. Remember, we said, first of all, that acidosis is any pH less than the normal plasma pH of 7.35. And we also said before that we have 2 different causes of acidosis. One is called respiratory acidosis, the other is metabolic acidosis. Respiratory acidosis is always caused by some problem with CO2, and in fact, since we're talking about acidosis, this is an increased level of CO2. Metabolic acidosis is caused by accumulation of acids or losses of bases from any other cause other than CO2, as we said before. So here we have accumulation of CO2. How do we get that? Well, we can have a decreased rate or depth of breathing, as in, for example, somebody breathing too slowly with a hypopnea. And so this would cause an accumulation of CO2 in the body. Anytime somebody has an obstruction of the air passages where they can't get rid of enough CO2, this would also cause a respiratory acidosis from accumulation of CO2. When we have decreased gas exchange, and for example, the CO2 can't get out of the blood into the alveoli to be exhaled, that would retain more CO2 in the body. That would cause an accumulation of CO2 as well. All of these causes that we looked at on the top will cause accumulation of CO2, which will cause a respiratory acidosis. We know it's respiratory because it is caused by CO2. Let's take a look at the metabolic acidosis. We can get into a metabolic acidosis 2 ways. If you think about the balance between hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, we can either accumulate too many acids or we can lose too many bases. Remember, it's the relative levels of hydrogen ion and bicarbonate that we're talking about regulating here. And that really is what is important for you to understand, okay? So it's those relative levels. Now, in the case where we have a metabolic acidosis, what we're looking at is something like this. So we have hydrogen ion here. Here we have bicarbonate ion. And you notice that in the metabolic acidosis, we have either an elevation of hydrogen ion or we have a decrease in base. Either one of those things will cause the acidosis. So how can that happen? Well, one of the things that can happen is the kidneys can fail to excrete acids. If we retain more acids in the body, that means these acids are contributing more hydrogen ions into solutions in the body. That will cause an accumulation of acid. We can also have an excess production of acids. For example, ketones, as in diabetes mellitus. Remember, we talked about the mechanism of this, and we said that when the glucose can't get into cells and the cells can't carry out that complete metabolism of glucose, we have basically fatty acids being incompletely metabolized. This is going to produce ketones, which are acidic. This is going to contribute more hydrogen ion into the body. So this is going to elevate the hydrogen ion in the body. On the other hand, we can have excessive losses of bases. Prolonged diarrhea, for example, with loss of alkaline secretions from the intestines. We have a lot of bases and buffers in the intestine to keep the pH in the intestine alkaline. And when diarrhea occurs, this causes a loss of many of those buffers. And so that will cause an excessive loss of bases. Prolonged vomiting with loss of intestinal secretions can also occur. Sometimes when severe vomiting occurs, what happens is fluids are taken not only from the stomach, but from the first part of the small intestine as well. And since this has a lot of bases in it, this can result in excessive loss of bases. Now, along with acidosis, we have these different symptoms in the body. We have nervous system depression, coma, and death. So these are basically all decreased states of awareness and metabolism. And I don't know if you remember when I talked about this, if we consider this over here to be a cell membrane, if we have an increase in hydrogen ion concentration in body fluids, let's say this is the extracellular fluid here, the increased hydrogen ion is going to diffuse into cells. In order to maintain electrical neutrality, what's going to happen is potassium ion is going to go out. And if you remember, when potassium ion leaves the cell, this causes a decrease in the membrane potential. And so cells that lose in excess of potassium ion are going to be hyperpolarized. And this is what causes the nervous system depression, coma, and the death. Let's turn our attention to the other side of the coin here with alkalosis. And what we're looking at with alkalosis is something like this now. We can either have a decrease in hydrogen ion, or we can have a relative increase in the amount of bicarbonate. So this is the situation that we're looking at with alkalosis. Remember, it's the relative balance, once again, of these two things. If we're talking about a respiratory alkalosis, remember, we're always talking about CO2. Anytime we term an alkalosis or an acidosis a respiratory phenomenon, we're talking about CO2. And the way for us to get into a respiratory alkalosis is to lose too much CO2. How can we do that? Well, anxiety can cause hyperventilation. Fever can cause us to breathe too fast. Some types of poisoning, high altitude. All of these things can basically cause a hyperventilation that will lead to excess loss of CO2. That's going to cause a decreased concentration of carbonic acid, a decrease in the concentration of hydrogen ion, and that's going to result in a respiratory alkalosis. So basically, a respiratory alkalosis is from a decreased CO2 concentration in the body. Now let's turn our attention to the other side of this, which is a metabolic alkalosis. In the metabolic alkalosis, we look at something like this. We can either have a decrease or loss of acid, or we can have a relative increase in bases. Okay, so either one of those things can cause this. Gastric drainage, for example. If somebody needs their stomach pumped or something happens where they need gastric drainage frequently, we can take away many, many hydrogen ions from the stomach and from the body. That will cause a relative decrease in hydrogen ion concentration. If somebody has vomiting with loss of gastric secretions primarily, this is also going to lose a lot of hydrogen ion. And then we can also have, as we said, a net increase in alkaline substances. Any one of those things can lead to a metabolic alkalosis, where the pH rises above the normal 7.5 upper limit of the homeostatic range of blood plasma. Now, alkalosis can cause pretty much the opposite kind of symptoms that we have in acidosis. Alkalosis can cause nervousness, tetany, convulsions, death. One of the reasons for this is that we have more potassium ion basically moving the way it shouldn't, and that causes a kind of hyperpolarization in the cells, opposite to what I just explained in the last slide. And this causes the nervousness, tetany, convulsions, and can ultimately cause death. Now, let's take a look at compensation and adjustment for acidosis and alkalosis. Now, we talked about this top part already. What would be the indications of acidosis and alkalosis in terms of changes in pH and PCO2? Well, in terms of pH and PCO2, remember, if we have an acidosis, we would have a drop in pH, or we would have a rise in CO2, or both. If we had a alkalosis, what we would have is a decrease in pH, and maybe a relative increase in bicarbonate. Okay, so keep in mind how the pH and levels of acid and levels of CO2 change as we talk about alkalosis and acidosis. So let's talk finally about compensation for acidosis and alkalosis. In acidosis, we can have, remember, two forms of this, as we can with alkalosis, two forms. One is respiratory. This is always caused by changes in levels of CO2. Metabolic is caused by anything else, right? So let's think about a respiratory acidosis. We said that in order for us to go into a respiratory acidosis, we would have to have an increase in CO2 concentration. And the reasons that we talked about having an increase in CO2 concentration could be something like respiratory obstruction or somebody not breathing enough, hypoventilation. So apparently there's some problem with the respiratory system. Now, is there another system that we have in the body that can actually compensate for this? Sure. Remember the kidneys, the most powerful and versatile acid-base management system that we have. If we have an increase in CO2, which leads to an increase in acid levels in the body, the kidneys can actually come into play, and now they can decrease the hydrogen ion concentration in the body by excretion of hydrogen ion. And remember, the other important thing they can do is they can also reabsorb more bicarbonate, and so affect kind of a balance between the increased hydrogen ion and the bicarbonate levels. So this is basically a way that the kidneys could compensate for the respiratory system. Now let's take a look at the opposite case and look at the alkalosis. Respiratory alkalosis, remember, is caused by a decrease in CO2 concentration. And so what we would say is that there's something wrong with the respiratory system. We're hyperventilating, for example, and blowing off too much CO2. Can the kidneys help? Absolutely. Right? What the kidneys can do in this case is they can excrete less hydrogen ion, or they can increase their excretion of bicarbonate, or simply not absorb so much bicarbonate. So these two things can actually be passed out into the urine, and this can help us adjust for a decreased CO2 level from the respiratory system. Now, can this work in reverse? Sure. Let's talk about acidosis and talk about a metabolic acidosis first. Let's say we have an increased amount of acid for some reason in the body. Or let's say that the kidneys can't excrete the normal amount of hydrogen ion that they usually do. Could the respiratory system help? Sure can, because what this respiratory system can do, remember, is increase the excretion of carbon dioxide. And when we increase the excretion of carbon dioxide, this brings acid levels down in the body. So the respiratory system can also function to compensate for the kidneys when they malfunction. And the same thing is true with alkalosis. If we have a metabolic alkalosis for some reason, that is, if we lose too much hydrogen ion, or if we gain too much base, can the respiratory system compensate? Sure. What can happen is we can slow the breathing rate, so the respiratory rate. This will cause an increase in CO2 concentration, which will ultimately cause an increase in hydrogen ion concentration in body fluids, and this can help to compensate for the metabolic problem that we're having. So the important point here to realize is that when one of these powerful systems, either the respiratory system or the urinary system, has a problem, the other system can help compensate. And that's very, very important. This is a very often used mechanism in the body to kind of keep the body in homeostasis. Okay, so that finishes up Lecture 17, and we'll see you next time for Lecture 18.